Hello everyone, I hope you're having a wonderful day. Today, we're going to explore the moment Yuri brings Tu Tieu to a community volunteer day and misses. Nia quietly places gloves in her hands, whispering, "Sometimes the best way to heal is to help someone else." Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next episode. Tu Tieu's hands shook a little as she tied her shoes. It wasn't the big shaking, the kind that comes with panic. It was smaller, quieter, like her body remembered old fears even when her mind tried to move forward. Yuri noticed, of course. He crouched near her and adjusted the laces the way you do for someone you love, not because they can't, but because love likes to be useful. No pressure, no performance. Tu Tieu nodded, but her stomach still fluttered. "People will look at me." Yuri's voice stayed calm. "They might. And then they'll go back to their soup. That's the best part of community places. Everyone's focused on what matters." Missus. Nia stepped out from her room with a small tote bag, the same kind of bag she always carried when she wanted to take care of someone. Inside were tissues, hand sanitizer, and a little pack of mints. "I brought these," she said, not making it dramatic. "People get thirsty, and hands get dry." Yuri smiled. "Mum, you're prepared for everything." Mrs. Nia lifted her chin. "That's my job." Tu Tieu glanced at Mrs. Nia's hands. Steady, practiced, gentle. She wondered if a person could borrow steadiness the way you borrow a sweater. Outside, the morning was cool and bright. As they drove, Yuri kept the radio low, soft oldies. Something familiar enough to feel safe. Tu Tieu watched neighborhoods slide by. Lawns, porches, bicycles, small signs of ordinary life. She used to think ordinary was boring. Now it looked like a miracle. The community center sat on a corner street beside a modest church. A banner hung across the entrance. "Saturday soup and care kits, all welcome." Tu Tieu read the words twice, like she was checking if welcome really applied to her. Yuri parked and reached for her hand. "Ready?" Tu Tieu inhaled. "I can try." Nia stepped out first, moving slower than she used to, but with purpose. The moment she walked in, it was as if she knew where to stand, where to look, how to belong. She didn't need a map. Inside, the room was warm with the smell of broth, bread, and coffee. Folding tables lined the walls. Volunteers wore simple aprons. Some were young, some older. People chatted quietly, laughing in that soft way that never feels loud. "Good morning, I'm Carol. Are you here to volunteer?" Yuri nodded. "Yes." "3 of us." Carol's gaze landed on Mrs. Nia, and her face brightened. "Oh, we're glad you're here." Tu Tieu caught the small familiarity in that sentence and realized Mrs. Nia had probably done this before. Maybe many times. Helping wasn't new to her. Carol handed them aprons. Yuri tied his around his waist like he'd done it 100 times. Mrs. Nia adjusted hers neatly. Tu Tieu held hers for a moment, unsure. Yuri stepped closer and tied the knot behind her gently. His hands were warm, steady. "You're biased." "I am," Yuri said, "and I'm right." They started with care kits, small bags filled with practical items. Socks, granola bars, a toothbrush, travel-sized toothpaste, a bottle of water, and a handwritten note. Mrs. Nia picked up a stack of blank cards and a pen. Today is a new day. Her eyes stung not because the message was sad, but because it was simple. The kind of sentence she'd needed her whole life. Tu Tieu reached for a card. Her hand hovered. "What should I write?" she whispered to Yuri. He just said, "Write what you would have wanted someone to say to you." Tu Tieu swallowed, then wrote, "I'm glad you're here." Please take care of yourself today. She stared at the words. They looked small, but when she slid the card into a bag, she felt something inside her settle, like a piece of her had found a place to rest. As the morning moved on, more people came in, some with tired faces, some with quiet dignity, some with eyes that looked like they'd seen too many hard nights. She reminded herself, these were not stories, these were people. Carol guided them to the serving table. Uri ladled soup with practiced ease. Mrs. Nia handed out bread rolls with gentle, "Here you go, dear," energy that made everyone soften. Tu Tieu stood beside them, tasked with giving water bottles and care kits. At first, she moved stiffly, like she was afraid of doing it wrong. Then a man with a worn baseball cap stepped forward. He took the soup, nodded, and said quietly, "Thank you." Tu Tieu managed a small smile. "You're welcome." It felt like the simplest conversation in the world, and yet her heart beat like she'd done something brave. Her hair was neatly combed, like she still cared how the world saw her. She accepted soup with polite hands, then paused. "Nia," then to Tu Tieu. "You two are family?" she asked softly. Tu Tieu's stomach tightened. That question still felt dangerous, like it could expose her. Uri answered calmly, "Yes." "You look young to carry that much worry," she said, almost like she was speaking to her younger self. Tu Tieu blinked. "I'm trying not to," she admitted. The woman nodded slowly. "Keep trying, it's worth it." Then she surprised Tu Tieu by reaching out and patting her hand, quick, gentle, motherly. "My name is Evelyn," she said. "I used to volunteer too, long time ago." Tu Tieu smiled, real this time. "I'm Tu Tieu." Evelyn's eyes softened. "Nice to meet you, honey." That word again, honey. Ordinary. Warm. Safe. Evelyn took her care kit, then hesitated. "Do you have extra gloves? My hands get cold." Tu Tieu glanced around, then remembered Mrs. Nia's tote bag in the corner, always prepared. She hurried over, pulled out a pair of soft knit gloves, and returned. "Here," Tu Tieu said, placing them in Evelyn's hands. Evelyn's face changed like someone had just turned a light on inside her. "Oh, bless you." Not adrenaline, not fear, something steadier. The room gradually emptied, leaving behind the faint scent of soup and the quiet satisfaction of effort. Carol approached them again. "Thank you," she said warmly. "You all did wonderful." Nia waved it off. "It's a good day." Carol looked at Tu Tieu. "First time volunteering?" Tu Tieu hesitated. "Yes." Carol smiled. "You did great." People could feel your kindness. Tu Tieu's eyes widened slightly. "They could?" Carol nodded. "Yes. Kindness is loud even when you whisper." On the ride home, Tu Tieu stared out the window again, but differently now. The world looked less like a place full of threats and more like a place full of chances. Uri glanced at her. "How are you doing?" Tu Tieu spoke slowly, as if she was testing a new truth. "I feel lighter." Mrs. Nia sat in the back seat, quiet, pleased. Then Tu Tieu added, "Like I'm not just healing, like I'm... That's what I wanted you to see." When they reached home, Tu Tieu opened the door and stepped inside. The house smelled like clean laundry and the herb plant by the window. "Mrs. Nia set her tote bag down and said casually, "After dinner, we write one more note." Tu Tieu blinked. "For who?" Mrs. Nia's smile was gentle. "For yourself." Tu Tieu's breath caught. She nodded. Dinner that night was simple soup again, because sometimes comfort repeats itself on purpose. Yuri warmed bread in the oven. Mrs. Nia set out bowls. Tu Tieu poured water like it was a small ceremony. They ate at the table without rushing, the way people do when their nervous systems are finally learning that time is not an enemy. Afterward, Mrs. Nia brought out 3 blank cards and a pen just like at the community center. Uri raised an eyebrow. "We're doing homework?" Mrs. Nia nodded. "Yes." Tu Tieu sat up straighter. "What kind?" "A note," she said, "to someone who needs it." "No teasing. This is serious." Tu Tieu stared at the blank card in front of her, heart thumping. The blankness felt louder than a room full of people. A blank card didn't allow hiding. Yuri began writing first, calm and steady. Mrs. Nia wrote slowly, her handwriting neat and careful. Tu Tieu held the pen but didn't move. Mrs. Nia noticed. "Do you remember what you wrote today?" Mrs. Nia asked softly. Tu Tieu nodded. "I'm glad you're here." Mrs. Nia's voice softened. "Now write that to yourself." Tu Tieu's eyes filled this time, not with sadness, but with something like relief. She swallowed and began. "Dear Tu Tieu, I'm glad you're here. You don't have to earn love. You don't have to run. You can be kind and still be safe." Her hand trembled, but she kept writing. When she finished, she looked up and realized Yuri was watching her with quiet pride. Mrs. Nia reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "Good," she whispered. Yuri cleared his throat. "Okay, my turn," he said, trying to lighten the mood without breaking it. He read his note aloud, short, simple, honest. "To the person I love, I see your effort. I see your courage. You're not alone in this life. We keep choosing each other." Tu Tieu's lips parted. "Who is that for?" she asked, voice small. Uri smiled. "You." Tu Tieu stared at him, overwhelmed by how tender he could be without making it dramatic. Mrs. Nia read hers next. Her voice was calm but full of weight. "To my family, thank you for coming home to each other. The world is hard, but our table can be soft. Let our kindness be our legacy." When she finished, the room went quiet. Not awkward quiet, holy quiet. Then Yuri said, "We should mail these." Tu Tieu blinked. "Mail them to ourselves?" Mrs. Nia nodded. "Yes, it will come back when you need it." The next morning, they drove to the post office together. It felt oddly joyful, 3 people mailing kindness like it was something you could schedule. Tu Tieu dropped her envelope into the slot and watched it disappear. "Like letting go," she whispered. Uri squeezed her hand, and trusting it'll return. Days passed, not with drama, with life. Tu Tieu watered the herb plant. Mrs. Nia watched a classic movie in the afternoon sunlight. Uri cooked, hummed softly, and kept his phone face down more often than not. Then one afternoon, a small stack of mail arrived. Tu Tieu sorted through it automatically, then froze when she saw the familiar handwriting on one envelope. Her own. Her heart jumped. She sat down slowly, like her knees suddenly forgot their job. Yuri came into the room. "What is it?" Tu Tieu held up the envelope with trembling fingers. It came back. Tu Tieu peeled the seal carefully, as if opening something fragile. She unfolded the card and read her own words written by a version of herself who had been brave enough to believe, "I'm glad you're here. You don't have to earn love. You don't have to run." Tu Tieu pressed the card to her chest and exhaled deep, steady, real. Uri's eyes softened. He sat beside her without speaking, letting her have the moment. Mrs. Nia sat across from them and watched like a mother watching a child learn to walk again. Tu Tieu looked up, voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know I could talk to myself like that. Mrs. Nia nodded. Now you do. Yuri brushed his thumb over Tu Tieu's knuckles. You did that, he said. Not fear, not the past. You. Tu Tieu laughed softly through a smile. No tears this time, just warmth. That evening, they returned to the community center, not to serve soup, but to drop off extra donated blankets. Mrs. Nia had quietly gathered from neighbors. Carol greeted them at the door with a grin. Look who's back! Tu Tieu felt her body tense for half a second, then relax. She smiled. Hi. Carol handed her a small stack of blank cards. Want to write a few more? Tu Tieu looked at the cards, then at Uri, then at Mrs. Nia. Yes. They sat at the same folding table, pens in hand. Tu Tieu wrote, You matter. You are seen. Today can be gentle. Then she wrote another. If you feel scared, hold someone's hand and name 3 safe things you see. She paused, realizing where the words had come from. Mrs. Nia's smile deepened, proud and quiet. Yuri leaned over and murmured, Look at you. Tu Tieu set the pen down and exhaled steady, calm, like the ocean had taught her. I'm not just healing, she said softly. I'm building something. Uri nodded. That's what family does. Mrs. Nia reached across the table and squeezed Tu Tieu's hand publicly, without hesitation. Tu Tieu looked at her and smiled. And in that ordinary community center, under fluorescent lights and beside a bowl of peppermints, Tu Tieu felt something she never thought she'd feel in public. Belonging. Yuri invites Tu Tieu to volunteer at a local community center, hoping a few quiet hours of service will help her rebuild confidence. Mrs. Nia arrives prepared with snacks, tissues, and spare gloves, reminding Tu Tieu she doesn't need to be perfect, only present. Inside the warm, busy room, they assemble care kits, serve soup, and write kind notes for strangers. Tu Tieu hesitates at first, worried about being judged, but small moments, like offering gloves to an older woman named Evelyn, help her relax and feel useful in a gentle way. That night, Mrs. Nia starts a new tradition. Each of them writes a note to someone who needs it most. Tu Tieu writes to herself, mails it, and days later receives her own words back, proof she can choose kindness, safety, and belonging.